Elizabeth Borgwart, in her book, A New Deal for the World, strongly argues that the liberal world order that has been hegemonic since 1945 traces its origins back to the New Deal policies of the Roosevelt administration. Borgwart argues that the seeds of many post-war institutions can be found in the Atlantic Charter, which in turn germinated from Roosevelt's conception of the Four Freedoms. This post-war liberal order was largely categorized by capitalist markets, multilateral frames of decision-making, and an assertion of individual human rights. Further, Borgwart contends that establishing this new world order was both imperative for a lasting peace, as well as immensely beneficial for the United States as a new hegemon. In an interesting way, allowing for multilateralism heightened American power. Borgwart first examines the Atlantic Charter itself, and then interrogates several of the multilateral institutions established by the Allies during and after the Second World War: Bretton Woods, the Nuremberg Charter, and the nascent United Nations. Borgwart makes a compelling case that the liberal world order was created by both the interests of the United States as well as a rather starry idealism, springing from the New Deal. Borgwart begins her examination by relating the story of how the Atlantic Charter was formed. A clandestine meeting of Roosevelt and Churchill on a British warship, months before the United States officially entered the war. The two-page document, jointly written by the British and American leaders, set out to assert several things. For one, it established the United States as clearly on the side of the Allies, America's neutrality notwithstanding. For another, it laid out the war aims of the Allies as well as the blueprint for a subsequent world order to prevent another global conflict. This new world order sought to balance both universal human rights as well as sovereignty, to balance open global markets and individual economic security. While this charter could be seen merely as a set of rhetorical flourishes, it laid the groundwork of many actual policy prescriptions. For many Allied planners, it was imperative to start constructing the new order as soon as possible, even well before the war was won. They argued that the peace process of the First World War was drastically flawed, insofar as the intended end goal was not articulated early enough. That failures to compromise both domestically and internationally left many feeling disregarded, and that the victorious nations only stated their aims for the new order once their victory was assured. This last point is particularly important in that a sense of revenge dominated much of the peace process, thus planting seeds for the next conflict. All these problems were chalked up to failures of Wilsonian diplomacy, failures that Roosevelt was not willing to repeat. Thus, the multilateral peace process began years before the victory was assured. The aims stated clearly, the principles established, and the blueprints for new institutions drawn up. Among the aims of this burgeoning liberal world order were 1. Global free trade, 2. Multilateral dispute resolution, and 3. An assertion of universal individual human rights. The Bretton Woods Conference sought to secure global free trade through a series of institutions and policies. Chief among these were normalizing global currency exchanges, pegging them to the US dollar to ensure price stability. It was observed that the Great Depression was largely caused by this lack of currency coordination. Many nations attempted to manipulate the values of their currency and dumping debts as they desperately tried to fend off the Great Depression. Yet, in doing so, ended up making the international situation worse. Further, it was believed that maintaining this economic stability was key in maintaining global peace. The previous depression gave birth to the radical ideologies that brought ruin to the world. The second institution the planners developed was to replace the defunct League of Nations. Wilson's brainchild that, ironically, the United States did not join, had spectacularly failed in its mission to prevent war. For one, it was dominated by the victors of World War I, and thereby seen as a mechanism to assert their dominance. The ideal of self-determination did not apply to the colonial subjects the British and French sat upon. Connected to this, many viewed the League as merely an instrument for enforcing the Treaty of Versailles and keeping the defeated under heel. Secondly, the League of Nations, despite all its rhetoric, was actually a toothless organization. They did nothing to stop the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, even when Ethiopia was a member. When the League rebuked Japan for its invasion of Manchuria, Japan simply left the table. The planners sought to create a new international organization to both protect the sovereignty of nations as well as mediate disputes before they became wars. It was hoped that this new organization would actually have teeth to enforce its judgments, as well as give more voice to smaller nations, a repudiation of past imperialism. However, it could be argued that the United Nations, like its predecessor, is also largely toothless. The third institution Borgward analyzes is the Nuremberg Charter. The trials of the same name and the establishment of human rights and international law. In many ways, the Nuremberg trials represented a culmination of the Atlantic Charter's ideals. Taking the remaining Nazi leadership, placing them on trial for their crimes for the world to see, and then executing them. The trials themselves were a balancing act. They were liable to be criticized as the victor's revenge, and thus the judges and prosecution tried to position their arguments as within the framework of law. They wished it to be seen as a criminal proceeding, not the boisterous gloating of conquerors. Yet, in attempting to be strictly legal, the prosecutors often stretched the meaning of international law. The primary thrust of the prosecution's argument was that the leaders were individually responsible for the crime of aggression. The leaders were also responsible for crimes against humanity, pursuant to these crimes of aggression. The idea of crimes against humanity was itself a rather new legal invention. It largely came from an assertion that the laws of civilized warfare were universal, regardless of whether nations signed particular treaties. Further, that the defendants were part of a criminal conspiracy and thus collectively responsible for crimes against humanity and aggression. The legal concept of conspiracy itself is rather unique to Anglo-American jurisprudence. As such, the French judges often balked at the concept. Another assertion made by the Nuremberg trial was that not only do individuals have inherent and universal human rights, but also that they have universal responsibilities. One could not merely say, "I was following orders," as a viable defense. Many nations, even among the victors, squirmed at the principles presented by the Nuremberg Charter. For one thing, it called into question Allied conduct during the war. If massacring civilians on the steppes of Ukraine is a war crime, what then of firebombing a city? If aggression in war is a war crime, what then of the Soviet Union's Pact of Iron with Germany, or the existence of France and Britain's imperial domains? If soldiers have an individual responsibility to disobey lawful orders, which law do they follow? One commentator noted fearfully that these principles would lead to mass insubordination within the American army. Much of these concerns came clearly to light during the Tokyo trials, where an Indian justice, Radhabinod Pal, wrote a 1,200-page minority report calling into question the very legitimacy of the tribunal. Other aspects of the trials seemed to itself raise doubts about some of the principles expressed. For instance, the prosecution did not, or could not, bring into evidence persecution of Jews before 1939. Could it be said, then, that whatever you do to your own citizens is just fine, so long as you don't do those same things to citizens of other nations? If human rights are universal, what then of sovereignty? Regardless of the critiques, the Nuremberg trials were key in establishing a universal individual human rights regime, one that has been dominant in narratives, discourse, and rhetoric since 1945. One could even make the argument that this human rights regime was utilized to justify American and NATO interventions around the world. It is striking how often the United States has deployed troops to foreign lands or launched airstrikes in the name of human rights. It is evident that these multilateral institutions often worked for the benefit of the United States as a hegemon, particularly in its economic interests. The new international frameworks clearly have liberal presuppositions baked into them. This results in a seeming imperial paradox. The United States giving up some of its hard power and sovereignty to only reap bigger rewards in terms of soft power and influence. Many smaller nations, in recognizing the new hegemonic order, also benefit from a growing global market and American security. Given such a multilateral framework that requires buy-in from all involved, it is fair to truly call it an imperial system. There certainly is evidence that many American planners viewed the other participating nations as mere junior partners, there just a sign on the dotted line. Harry White, with a chuckle, said that the Cubans were invited to Bretton Woods because, quote, their main function would be to bring cigars, unquote. Further, it is interesting that many nations that the United States views as enemies or threats are labeled rogue, in that they eschew the liberal, i.e., American, world order. Yet, on the other hand, the new framework and rhetoric opened the door for many smaller nations to assert themselves in ways that they had been unable to do so before. Taking the rhetoric seriously, they asserted their rights of independence and sovereignty. The same went for minority groups within the hegemon itself. Arguably, the Atlantic Charter planted the seeds for a successful civil rights movement a decade later. Borgward makes a very compelling case and sheds light on lanes of analysis that is often overlooked, as she herself points out. Often historians jump from VE Day straight to the Cold War. While her point is well taken, it also seems to reveal somewhat of a weakness in her analysis. Borgward's analysis seems to treat the United States as if it was the sole and unassailable hegemon, largely leaving the Soviet Union out of the equation. It seems that she is treating the United States as the primary actor, with everyone else towing the line. Borgward presents the scenario as if 1945 to 47 was a unipolar world. It could be argued that both the Soviet Union and the United States were aspiring hegemonic powers trying to shape their own separate world orders, though they cooperated in a few key institutions like the United Nations. This would better draw a connection between her analysis and the burgeoning Cold War, rather than the sudden reversal of policy that she presents. That critique being said, Borgward does a masterful job in demonstrating her thesis.